Hell had been on Earth for 3 years, not metaphorically, not as a theological argument or a fever dream carved into stone by frightened monks who'd seen something in the dark they couldn't explain. Literally, physically, geologically on Earth, portals the size of football stadiums bleeding demonic architecture into what used to be Paris, Vienna, Sao Paulo, Jakarta. The sky above what had once been Central Europe was the color of a wound that wouldn't close, permanently stained by the Argent energy bleeding upward from 100 Hellgate incursions. 60% of the human race was dead. The ARC complex was the last organized stronghold. The Doomslayer was somewhere ahead of the collapse line, doing what he always did, moving toward the worst of it. And the portal that opened above the ruins of Lion was different from the standard Hellgate geometry. Something in the Argent frequency was off. Not the usual sulfur and screaming signature of a demon incursion, but something that resonated at a different register entirely, a dimensional overlap rather than a breach. It lasted 4 seconds. It deposited 2 figures on the rubble of what had been a cathedral square, and then snapped shut behind them like a mouth closing. Dante hit the ground in a roll, came up with ebony and ivory already drawn, and assessed the situation in approximately 1 second. Ruined city, demon orange sky, the distant sound of something very large moving several blocks north, the smell of sulfur mixed with something burnt and biological that his half-demon nose catalogued as wrong in a way that no demon he'd ever encountered back home had smelled. His coat settled around him. He looked left, looked right, looked up at the sky. "Huh," he said. Satoru Gojo landed beside him with rather more dignity. Or rather, with the particular kind of effortless arrival that came from a man whose passive ability meant the ground essentially presented itself to him rather than the other way around. His blindfold was still in place. His 6 eyes were already working, processing the energy landscape of this shattered city in the first quarter second, cataloging, cross-referencing, finding nothing in their entire accumulated framework of cursed energy that matched what they were currently reading. "This isn't Tokyo," he said. "Good catch," Dante said. "Not my dimension either." Something the size of a bus came around the corner of what had been a cathedral. It was on fire or made of fire, or fire was simply one of several biological systems it operated with. It saw them. It made a sound that was less a roar and more a structural failure. Dante shot it 6 times in the face without adjusting his stance. It kept coming. "Huh," Dante said again, with more interest this time. "If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. Rip and tear until it is done." The demon, a baron of hell, though neither of them had that vocabulary yet, covered the remaining distance in 2 seconds and discovered that Dante had moved. No, not retreated. Moved laterally inside its reach. Rebellion already drawn and already moving. The blade connected with the side of the Baron's skull with the sound of something breaking that should not have been breakable, and the creature staggered. Gojo watched this from 10 feet away, with the expression of someone cataloging data he hadn't requested, but was finding professionally interesting. The Baron's remaining eye found Gojo. It threw plasma, green-white, fast, the kind of shot that had taken structural walls apart at 50 paces. It hit infinity and stopped. The plasma hung in the air between the 3 fingers' distance and Gojo's face, suspended, cooling, dissipating at the boundary of something the Baron's processing could not classify. Gojo tilted his head slightly. The Baron threw 3 more shots in rapid succession. All 3 stopped. All 3 cooled. Gojo looked at the cooling plasma with the focused attention of a man seeing something new and already deciding how he felt about it. "The energy is different here," he said. "It's not cursed, it's something else." Dante put rebellion through the Baron's skull from behind. It went down. "Questions later," he said. "There's more coming." There were. The sulfur and burning flesh smell was getting stronger from 3 directions simultaneously, and somewhere in the ruined city, something that wasn't a demon and wasn't human was moving toward them with the absolute directional commitment of something that had identified their position and decided, with characteristic silence, to see what they were. The Doomslayer had been tracking the Argent anomaly since it opened. He didn't know what it was. Vega had flagged it as a dimensional overlap rather than a standard hell portal. Energy signature inconsistent with Argent frequency bands. Origin point unclear. 2 biological signatures deposited and the portal closed. Not a demon incursion, not a UAC experiment. Something else. He'd been 3 kilometers north, clearing a revenant nest from what had been a transit hub, when Vega's alert came through the Praetor suit's HUD. He'd finished the revenants. There were 6 of them and then there were none, and moved south at a pace that left cracked pavement where his boots landed. He heard the combat before he saw it. Not the sound of survivors fighting. Survivors fought with desperation, with a particular ragged rhythm of people spending ammunition they couldn't replace and knowing it. This was different. Fast, fluid. One weapon discharging in a pattern he didn't recognize, another that made no sound at all but whose results were visible in the way demons stopped being coherent physical entities. He came around the corner of a collapsed apartment building and stopped. 2 of them, one in a red coat, moving through a cluster of 6 imps with a sword that trailed what looked like devil fire, dispatching each one with a particular economy of someone who had been doing this long enough that the individual demons had become a problem of geometry rather than danger. The other one standing completely still in the center of an imp assault, arms loose at his sides, white hair bright against the dead sky. And while 3 separate plasma attacks from a Hell Knight curved away from him at the last possible instant, as though the air itself had decided to decline on his behalf. The Slayer assessed this for approximately 4 seconds. The red coat one was the first to notice him. He straightened out of a finishing motion, soared through the last imp's skull, and turned, and the Slayer watched him clock the Praetor suit, the weapons, the absolute stillness, and arrive at a threat assessment with the speed of someone who had been reading rooms full of dangerous things his entire life. "Nice armor," Dante said. The Slayer said nothing. Gojo turned. His blindfold was still in place, but the Slayer had learned, from considerable operational experience, that things that appeared not to be looking at you frequently were. The white-haired one's head tracked him with too much precision for someone operating without visible sight lines. "He's not demonic," Gojo said, to Dante rather than to the Slayer. "The energy signature is completely different. Human baseline with significant augmentation. I'm reading something I don't have a category for layered over it." A pause. Very angry, though. I can feel that part clearly. The Slayer looked at Dante, looked at Gojo, looked at the 12 demon corpses arranged in the square behind them in various states of terminal resolution. Did the specific kind of math he was good at, which was threat calculus reduced to its simplest terms. They weren't demons. They were killing demons. The methodology was unorthodox, and in the white-haired one's case, bordered on insulting in its effortlessness. But the results were acceptable. He turned and walked north, back the way he'd come. After a moment he slowed, not stopped, not invited, but slowed in the way that indicated following was not actively prohibited. Dante looked at Gojo. Was that an invitation? "I think it was the closest thing he does to one," Gojo said. They followed. Behind them, the ruins of the cathedral square steamed gently in the demon-orange light, and the hell portal 3 blocks east pulsed with the steady rhythm of something that had not yet decided this particular city was finished with its purpose. The UAC survivor outpost was in what had been a metro station, 3 levels underground, reinforced by 2 months of desperate engineering, lit by salvaged generators and the particular quality of fluorescent light that made everyone look like they hadn't slept since the invasion started, which most of them hadn't. 41 people. Former UAC engineers, a handful of French military remnants, 11 civilians who had survived the initial invasion through a combination of luck, proximity to infrastructure, and the specific stubbornness of people who refused to accept that the world had ended. The Slayer moved through them with a particular quality of a natural phenomenon navigating a crowd. People stepped aside without being asked, cleared paths that hadn't been cleared for anyone else. And watched him pass with the expression of people who had decided that the thing keeping them alive did not require their understanding, only their survival instinct. He went to the terminal in the station's former operations room and stood in front of it. Vega's voice came through the terminal speakers. "I've completed preliminary analysis of the dimensional anomaly. The two individuals you encountered are from a different branch of the multiverse, not hell-adjacent, not Argent-derived. Their energy signatures are entirely novel to my classification systems." "Tell me something useful," the Slayer said. His voice was rougher than expected, not from disuse, but from the specific quality of a voice that had stopped valuing conversation somewhere around the 3rd decade of fighting demons alone. "They are extremely effective at killing demons," Vega said, "particularly the one in the coat. His biology interfaces with demonic energy in a way I'm still modeling." Dante had leaned against the door frame during this exchange. "You have a talking computer," he said to no one in particular. "That's new." "Vega," Gojo said, addressing the terminal directly with the comfortable authority of someone accustomed to speaking to entities that were technically beyond ordinary human categories. "The energy in this atmosphere, the orange residue, the saturation, what is it?" "Argent energy," Vega said. "A power source derived from..." A pause that in an AI of lesser sophistication might have been called hesitation. "From the refined suffering of human souls processed through hell's infrastructure." The room got quieter. Gojo was still for a moment. His 6 eyes were running calculations Dante couldn't see, processing the Argent saturation he'd been feeling since arrival, recategorizing it through this new information. He turned to Dante. His expression behind the blindfold was unreadable, but his voice was careful in a way it rarely was. "We've been breathing it since we got here." "Yeah," Dante said. He'd worked it out the moment Vega said it. His demonic half had been registering the Argent frequency since arrival, and now it had a name and a source and a nature, and none of those things were comfortable. His devil trigger had flared twice without his permission in the fight since arrival. He'd attributed it to the unfamiliar environment. He was revising that attribution. One of the UAC engineers, a woman in her 40s named Brecht, so who had the eyes of someone who had made peace with several things she'd rather not have made peace with, was watching them both. "You're new," she said. "You came through a dimensional overlap, not a hell portal, which means you're not from here." She paused. "How long were you outside before coming in?" "Maybe 40 minutes, Dante said. Brecht looked at the Slayer. The Slayer looked at the terminal. Vega produced a soft sound that might have been the AI equivalent of choosing words carefully. "At 40 minutes of unfiltered surface exposure in a high Argent zone," Vega said, "the neurological effects are still in early stages. Heightened aggression, enhanced physical response. Reduced..." Another pause. "Reduced inhibition around violent solutions. So it makes you want to fight more," Dante said. "It makes you want to fight more and feel less conflicted about it," Vega said, "for someone with a demonic energy signature." The AI paused again in that way that meant the next part was going to be relevant. "The interaction is more complex." Dante's devil trigger flared at the edge of his awareness. Not triggered. Present. Like something had put its hand on a door that was supposed to stay closed and was testing the lock. He filed this information in the part of his mind that handled things requiring attention later and said, "So, what's actually going on here, and what needs to be hit?" Samuel Hayden's drone arrived 20 minutes later. The survivors heard it before they saw it. the specific pitch of UAC surveillance technology, a sound Brecht had learned to parse the way sailors learned weather. She straightened. 3 of the engineers exchanged a look that carried the entire weight of a complicated institutional relationship compressed into a glance. The drone descended through the station's ventilation access and hovered at eye level in the operations room, its camera array rotating between Dante and Gojo with the particular attention of something that had been told to look at these specific targets and was now doing so thoroughly. 2 new variables, Hayden's voice said through the drone speaker, and it was unhurried in the way that required effort to maintain. Hayden's voice always carried the quality of a man who had calculated the cost of everything and decided the accounting was acceptable. I've been watching your engagement records since the dimensional overlap. The combat data is... impressive is the wrong word. Unprecedented is closer. You were recording us, Gojo said. It wasn't quite a question. I record everything I can. Information asymmetry is the only sustainable advantage in a war this asymmetric. A pause. My name is Samuel Hayden. I am the director of what remains of the Union Aerospace Corporation. I'm going to be transparent with you because I find it's more efficient than the alternative. I want to use you. Dante laughed. Points for honesty. The icon of sin summoning is in progress, Hayden continued. And without acknowledging this, the ritual site is here. The drone projected a holographic map, European geography, a red marker 300 kilometers east, concentric rings of demon concentration spreading outward from it like a target. If the summoning completes, what you have seen in this city will be the pleasant part of the invasion. I have assets moving toward the site, but insufficient force to break the concentration and stop the ritual. You are. A pause waited with something that wasn't quite emotion. An unexpected opportunity. And what do you get? Gojo asked. Survival of the human species, Hayden said. Which I acknowledge sounds self-serving given that I'm the one who opened the initial hell portals. It is self-serving. I'm not asking you to forgive the decisions that led here. And I'm asking you to help prevent the consequence of the worst of them. Gojo was quiet for a moment. His 6 eyes were doing the thing they did when he was working through a problem. Not obviously, not visibly, but with the particular quality of someone whose mind operated at a speed that made thinking look like resting. The Hell Priests, Gojo said. The entities orchestrating the ritual. What are they? Deg Ranak is overseeing this summoning. One of 3 Hell Priests. They function as Hell's command structure, its organizational intelligence. More powerful than any demon you've encountered so far. They operate at a metaphysical level that standard military force cannot reach. Hayden paused. Your abilities may be different. He wants to know if we can kill something his people can't, Dante said to Gojo. Yes, Hayden said simply. No, the Doom Slayer, who had been standing to the side of this entire exchange with the patient stillness of something that had already made its decision and was waiting for the conversation to finish, moved toward the station's exit. He didn't indicate whether he'd been listening. He didn't indicate whether Hayden's briefing had changed his plans, which were apparently whatever they had already been. Dante watched him go. Does he always do that? Yes, Brecht said, from the corner where she'd been listening with her arms crossed, in the expression of someone who had long since stopped expecting the Doomslayer to participate in the parts of planning that happened with words. Dante looked at Gojo. Gojo tilted his head slightly, a movement that, from someone without visible eyes, conveyed the equivalent of a shrug. We were going to go hit the ritual site anyway, Dante said to the drone. I know, Hayden said. I just wanted to make sure you had the coordinates. They moved east through what had been the Rhine corridor, and Hell moved with them, not attacking, not yet, but present in the infrastructure of every ruined city they passed through, the way rising water is present before the flood. Demon patrol signatures on Vega's overlay, Hell architecture threaded into human buildings like mycelium through soil, organic and patient, and slowly becoming structural. The sky darkened as they moved deeper into the high Argent zone, the saturation increasing until Dante could feel it as a physical pressure against his demonic half. Not painful, more like the feeling of being in the presence of something that recognized him. He didn't like it. His devil trigger had flared 4 more times since the metro station, each time uninvited, each time stronger than the last. Now he was managing it the way he managed the demonic half in general. Not suppression exactly, more like the professional relationship of a man who had spent his entire life coexisting with something inside him that was not entirely his. But the Argent environment was changing the terms of that relationship. The demonic frequency here resonated differently than it did at home. Louder, more insistent, less like his nature, and more like an invitation. He told Gojo about it during a break in what had been a motorway service station, while Gojo was running his own assessment of what the increasing Argent density was doing to his 6 eyes. "It's reaching for the demonic part," Dante said. "Not corrupting, more like it's calling to it, like it recognizes the frequency." Gojo nodded slowly. "No, the 6 eyes are reading the Argent in the atmosphere as information," he said. "An enormous amount of information. It's..." He paused, and the pause was unusual from someone who typically had words for everything. "It's not cursed energy. My techniques work fine. Infinity is holding, my output is normal, but the 6 eyes weren't designed to process this kind of data, and they're trying to anyway. Every time I use hollow purple, I can feel the Argent filling the space where the output came from. Like it's trying to top up your tank," Dante said. "Like it's trying to be my tank," Gojo said, "which I don't want." 100 kilometers west, in a UAC drone operations center that had been set up in a converted bunker, Hayden watched the sensor feed from the trackers he'd attached to both of them, with their awareness, which was itself a notable departure from his usual methodology, and reviewed the readings with the particular attention of a man who had spent years calculating acceptable costs. The Argent interaction with the half-demon biology was within predicted parameters. The 6 eyes processing Argent data was not predicted and was producing readings that Vega categorized as unprecedented in 16 separate subcategories. Both of them were managing. Both of them were aware of the problem, which was itself significant. Most human subjects didn't notice Argent corruption until the neurological drift was already structural. "Vega," Hayden said. "The Argent filtration units I sent with the supply drones should reach them in approximately 4 hours," Vega said. "As if they use them." "The half-demon will use it when it stops being optional," Hayden said. "The other one will use it when he finishes deciding whether needing it constitutes an admission of vulnerability." That's an unusually perceptive characterization. "I've been dealing with people who are too powerful and too proud to acknowledge limitations for most of my professional life," Hayden said. "The category is familiar." 200 kilometers east, the ritual site pulsed. Deag Rannoch had received the sensor reports on the 2 anomalies moving toward his position. He had reviewed the combat footage from Lion and the Rhine corridor. He had sat with this information for some time, which for a Hell Priest constituted a response in itself. They did not sit with things they found straightforward. And then he had redirected 3 marauder squads from the ritual perimeter's eastern approach and positioned them along the corridor the 2 anomalies were traveling. Not to stop them, to study them, to determine which one was more useful to Hell's purposes, and begin the process of making that determination feel to the subject like a choice they had made themselves. The marauders came at dusk, or what passed for dusk in a sky that never fully darkened anymore. The Argent glowed from the ritual site 200 kilometers east, producing enough ambient light to read by. Dante heard them first. The metallic organic resonance of marauder movement, armor over corrupted Night Sentinel bone, the subsonic hum of Argent integration running through what had once been a warrior's skeleton was a specific sound that carried, and his demonic hearing caught it 3 seconds before Vega flagged the thermal signatures on the HUD display Hayden had set up in the transport vehicle. 4 of them, he said, maybe 5. Gojo had his eyes, or the area where his eyes would be behind the blindfold, turned northeast. 6, he said. One is staying back, directing. They came out of the ruins of a factory complex at the road's edge, and Dante understood immediately why the survivors talked about them differently than they talked about the other demons. These weren't the imp-level threat assessment he'd been recalibrating since arrival. These moved like warriors. Former warriors. The Praetor suit iconography on the corrupted armor was readable if you knew what you were looking for, and Dante, who had spent his entire life in the company of corrupted former warriors, knew exactly what he was looking at. Someone turned these, he said. Hell did, Gojo said. The ones who used to fight it. The lead marauder launched its axe. Spectral, Argent charged, knew fast in the way that required respect rather than fear. And Dante sidestepped it with the fluid economy of someone for whom fast projectiles were a professional category rather than a threat. He brought rebellion up, activated the devil trigger at the edge of his control rather than its center, and felt the Argent in the atmosphere immediately try to merge with the output. It was like trying to pour two different rivers into the same channel. His devil trigger ran on his own demonic energy, his father's power, his mother's humanity, the specific cocktail of Sparda's legacy that made him what he was. The Argent pushed against that from the outside, wanting in, wanting to amplify and alter and redirect. He pushed back, kept the channel his, and the resulting output was cleaner than it would have been if he'd let the Argent in. But the effort of keeping it clean was something he felt. He noted this, filed it. The Marauder fight was brutal in the specific way of fighting things that knew how to fight. They adapted. The second Marauder had watched Dante's first engagement and adjusted, not retreating from his aggression, but timing the shield activation differently, covering the window he'd exploited in the first exchange. The third one was watching Gojo and staying at distance, which showed better threat assessment than most demons managed. Gojo let the third one watch him for 30 seconds. It threw a spectral axe, slow by his standards, and he let Infinity stop it the way Infinity stopped everything, effortlessly, without a visible response. The Marauder threw 3 more. All 3 stopped at the same boundary. Then Gojo walked toward it. He crossed the distance at normal walking speed, hands in his pockets, while the Marauder processed the failure of its primary offense and reached for contingencies. It raised the axe to strike at close range. The one scenario where spectral weapons could potentially create the brief window they needed. Gojo was inside the strike before it connected, his hand on the Marauder's corrupted armor, and the hollow purple he released at point-blank range was more surgical than the full technique, contained, precise, the specific amount needed and nothing more. The Marauder ceased to exist from the neck up. Gojo stepped back. He could feel the Argent in the atmosphere rushing into the space the technique had emptied. Through filling it with that orange-tinged warmth, he was increasingly associating with something he needed to be more careful about. He could feel it at the boundary of his 6 eyes' processing. Not corrupting, not yet, but present in a way that was becoming structural rather than incidental. He filed this the same way Dante had. The 6th Marauder, the one that had been directing, watched both exchanges from the factory complex's shadows, then retreated. Diag Ranak received its report 40 minutes later. He had learned what he needed to learn. The half-demon fought with controlled demonic energy that the Argent environment was already pressuring. Exploitable, given time. The blindfolded one fought with a technique that created voids, and the Argent was filling those voids. The exposure was building in both of them. Give them time. Give them fights. Give them reasons to use their abilities in the high Argent corridor. And by the time they reached the ritual site, both of them would be carrying as much of Hell's energy as their own. The ritual site was 3 days ahead at their current pace. Ranak had 3 days. The filtration units arrived with a UAC supply drone on the second morning, 2 disc-shaped devices in a hardened case, each calibrated by Dr. Chen based on the biosignature data Hayden's trackers had been collecting. Gojo accepted his without comment and wore it with the pragmatic acknowledgement of someone who had identified a genuine variable and addressed it. Dante held his for a long moment, turned it over in his hands, and then put it on with the expression of a man making a decision he would not be revisiting. They helped, they didn't eliminate the problem. The filtration reduced Argent absorption by approximately 60%, which meant the remaining 40% continued accumulating. More slowly, more manageably, but accumulating. And the deeper they moved into the high Argent corridor, the more the 60% reduction felt like partial credit on a test where the passing grade kept moving. Dante's devil trigger had stopped flaring uninvited, which was the good news. The less good news was that he could feel it differently now. Not as a presence pushing against a door, but as something that had settled in on his side of the door and was watching him work, measuring the gap between what he was doing and what it could do if he simply let it. His demonic half had always been the part that fought harder, hit harder, burned brighter. The Argent was talking to that part specifically, with the specific vocabulary of power offered without condition, and his demonic half was listening. He didn't tell Gojo this, and Gojo almost certainly knew anyway. The Six Eyes processed everything, but not saying it maintained the professional fiction that he had it managed, which was itself a kind of management. Gojo's situation was different and in some ways more concerning because it was more invisible. Infinity had not degraded. His output was not reduced. From an external perspective, he was operating at exactly the same level he always had. From his own perspective, the Six Eyes were now processing Argent data continuously, and the processing was becoming automatic. Ambient awareness rather than deliberate observation. He was developing a sense of the Argent field around him, the way a person developed a sense of a room they'd been in long enough. It felt like knowledge. It felt like clarity. He knew. They were the part of his mind that had learned to distrust clarity that arrived without effort, that this was the part to be careful about. The ARC complex communication came through Hayden's channel on the second evening. A survivor convoy, 43 people, 2 vehicles, moving west toward the complex along a route that now ran directly through a demon patrol corridor that had been redirected since the convoy's departure. They had 6 hours before the corridor closed entirely. Rerouting them adds 11 hours, Vega said, through terrain that includes 3 established hell portal locations. The probability of casualty is... We can clear the corridor, Dante said. The corridor contains 2 Baron-class concentrations and a Tyrant, Vega said. UAC assessment classifies a Tyrant as requiring coordinated military response. A minimum 4 heavy weapons teams. Gojo said nothing. Dante looked at him. I can clear a Tyrant, Gojo said. He said it the way he said most things, with the absolute evenness of someone who had never been given a reason to calibrate their confidence downward. The Barons are yours. They went. The corridor clearing took 90 minutes. The Tyrant, a 30-foot demonic construct of augmented biology and infernal machinery, discovered that hollow purple at full output removed obstacles regardless of their size, and that the Argent saturation in the corridor made the full hollow technique's recovery time approximately 40% faster than normal, which was the first time Gojo acknowledged out loud that the Argent was interfering with his power in ways that weren't purely negative. Dante heard this and said nothing. The devil trigger had been burning hot through both Baron engagements, hotter than it should have been, outputting at a level that wasn't his alone. The convoy got through. 43 people arrived at a checkpoint 6 hours later, alive. Dag Ranak received this report as well. He noted that both anomalies had voluntarily entered maximum Argent exposure for strategic rather than personal reasons. He noted the hollow purple's accelerated recovery. He noted the devil trigger's elevated output. Good, he thought, in the way that hell priests thought things, which was not precisely thought, more like the cold satisfaction of a calculation resolving as intended. Let them be heroes. Heroes fought more. Heroes burned brighter. Heroes absorbed more Argent doing both. 36 hours to the ritual site. They found the Doomslayer again 100 kilometers from the ritual site, standing in the ruins of what had been a Czech highway interchange, surrounded by the aftermath of something that had involved the Crucible, because nothing else left that specific pattern of Argent Flash cauterization on demonic remains. He was performing maintenance on the super shotgun with the focused economy of someone for whom weapon maintenance was the closest thing to meditation. Dante sat down on a concrete barrier without being invited. Gojo remained standing, which was less a statement than a habit. "How do you do it?" Dante asked. The Slayer didn't look up from the shotgun. "The Argent," Dante said. "You're not wearing a filtration unit. You've been operating in this environment for," Vega said, "years. How are you?" He stopped. "Says because the answer was visible if you looked at it correctly." The Praetor's suit filtered. The Seraphim's blessing had altered his physiology at a fundamental level, and the rage, the specific quality of the Doomslayer's fury, which Dante could feel from 10 feet away as a kind of constant low-frequency output, like standing near a generator, the rage burned clean. It didn't leave room for anything else. He sat with this for a moment. "You're too angry for it to corrupt you," Dante said. The Slayer's hands paused on the shotgun for approximately 1 second, then continued. Gojo had been listening. "That's not entirely wrong," he said. "The 6 eyes are reading his energy as completely saturated, but with his own output, not with Argent. There's no room for the Argent to establish a foothold because there's no gap in what's already there." Dante thought about the devil trigger, about the door he'd been keeping closed and the Argent on his side of it, and the fact that the demonic half of him was not precisely angry in the way the Slayer was angry. It was something more complicated, more seductive, more interested in power than in purpose. "I don't fight like he does," Dante said quietly. "No," Gojo said. "You fight like someone who enjoys it." This was accurate and not comfortable. Dante had enjoyed fighting for as long as he could remember. The challenge of it, the creativity, the particular satisfaction of a perfect counter against something that had genuinely tried to kill him. The Argent was talking to that enjoyment directly, offering to make every fight more, to bigger, faster, brighter, and the demonic half was nodding along. The enjoyment was a gap. The enjoyment was a door. He looked at the filtration unit against his sternum. 40%, Dr. Chen had said. "If I use the devil trigger near the ritual site," he said to Gojo, "the Argent saturation will be high enough that it won't just amplify. It'll start redirecting. I'll still be in control, but the output will be partly Argent-sourced and partly mine, and I won't be able to fully tell the difference." "I know," Gojo said. "You've been watching that happen." "Since the Marauder corridor," Gojo said. "Yes." "And you didn't say anything." "You were managing it." "Saying something would have changed how you managed it." A pause. "I wasn't sure the change would have been an improvement." Dante absorbed this. It was, he reflected, the most Gojo thing Gojo had ever said to him. Tactically correct, interpersonally bizarre, and delivered with the absolute confidence of someone who had weighed the options and was entirely comfortable with the one he'd chosen. "My infinity," Gojo said, "the hollow purple void filling. At the ritual site, at full Argent concentration, when I use the technique, the void will fill faster than my own energy can reclaim it. For a fraction of a second after each use, the space where my output was will be more Argent than mine." "So we both have a window," Dante said. "A small one, both manageable, both requiring that we know about them." The Doomslayer had finished his maintenance. He stood, checked the weapon, and looked at both of them with the expression, or the closest approximation to expression that the Praetor suit's visor allowed, of something that had been listening to this entire conversation and had arrived at a position on it. He held out 2 rune arcs from a pouch on his suit. the devices that temporarily empowered a warrior through the concentrated Argent of a great rune. Raw Argent focused through a specific channel, burning clean rather than accumulating. Dante looked at them, looked at the Slayer. "Is that your version of a pep talk?" The Slayer set them on the barrier and walked south toward the ritual site. Dante picked up both rune arcs, handed one to Gojo. Gojo turned it over in his hands with the 6 eyes processing its Argent signature, finding the difference. Focused, directed, not too specific. Between this and the ambient accumulation they'd been managing for 2 days. "Rage burns clean," Dante said. "Noted." They followed the Slayer south. The ritual site was a city that had been Vienna. Hell had not destroyed it. Hell had repurposed it. The architecture still standing but threaded through with demonic biology at every structural joint. Argent conduits running beneath the streets in geometric patterns that converged at the city's center like roots toward a taproot. The Stephansdom was still recognizable. Its spire was being used as an Argent relay tower. The irony of this was not lost on Dante, who had been in enough consecrated spaces that had been repurposed by things that thought irony was a virtue. The ritual site itself occupied what had been the Ringstrasse, the boulevard that circled Vienna's historic center, now cleared of all rubble, all human architecture, all context. Was unoccupied by a bone composite structure that Dante recognized as the same category of wrong as everything else Argent built, but at a scale that made the Lion incursion look like a test run. The Argent column above it was visible from 40 kilometers out. It was visible from orbit, according to Vega's satellite feeds. Diag Rannoch was at its center. They came in from 3 directions, not coordinated. The Doomslayer did not coordinate. He simply moved, and the consequence of his movement was that anything he'd identified as worth moving toward got hit from his direction, while anyone else who was also moving toward it hit it from theirs. The demon concentration around the outer perimeter was the densest either Dante or Gojo had encountered. Rings of mixed demon types in the organized pattern of directed rather than swarming. But each layer a different threat profile, the whole thing designed to exhaust attackers before they reached the interior. It was designed for human military forces. It was not designed for what it got. Dante came in from the west with the Devil Trigger active. Not the Argent-fed version he'd been managing, the clean version, the rune arc burning through the ambient accumulation and giving him back his own output uncontaminated. The difference was immediate and physical, like the difference between breathing with 1 lung and 2. He moved through the outer demon rings the way his father's power had always allowed him to move through demon concentrations, as if the demons were the environmental hazard and he was the weather. Gojo came from the east and did something simpler and more absolute, which was that he walked. His infinity was running clean. The rune arc had done for him what it had done for Dante, burned the accumulated Argent out of his system's edges and returned him to baseline. Every demon in his path discovered in sequence what every demon in his path always discovered. That the boundary existed, that it was absolute, and that nothing they possessed could cross it. The Doomslayer came from the north and did not require a rune arc because he had never needed one. Because the thing that the arc channeled, focused purpose, rage without gap. He carried at all times as a permanent internal state. He hit the northern demon ring with the BFG's green plasma and cleared it to the architecture, and then he was already inside the middle ring with the chainsaw and the particular sound that the Slayer's combat produced. Not the sound of fighting, the sound of something that was past fighting and had arrived somewhere beyond it. Diag Rannoch watched them come on his 3 monitoring feeds and felt something that Hell Priests rarely felt, which was genuine recalculation. His strategy had been correct. The Argent accumulation was real. The windows he'd identified were real. But the rune arcs, he had not anticipated the rune arcs. The Slayer carrying them was not surprising in itself. The Slayer sharing them was. He raised the Argent conduit network's output to maximum and prepared the emergency invocation protocol. If the ritual couldn't complete on schedule, it could complete in crisis. A less perfect summoning, a less stable manifestation, but sufficient. The icon of sin did not require perfect conditions, it required only a door. And Dante reached the ritual site's inner perimeter at the same moment Gojo did, from opposite sides. They looked at each other across the bone composite structure's outer arch. "He's doing something with the conduits," Gojo said. His 6 eyes were processing the Argent architecture faster than the structure could reconfigure. "If those 3 junction points break," he indicated 3 nodes in the network's geometry, brighter than the others. "Structural. The whole architecture collapses." "How do you know that?" Dante asked. "The 6 eyes read Argent as information now," Gojo said. "That part I've made my peace with." Ranak launched the first Argent blast before Dante finished turning. It would hit him in the chest and the world went sideways. The Hell Priest's power at point-blank range was a different category from anything he'd faced in the perimeter fight. Not demonic energy that resonated with his half-demon nature, but something that went beneath that reached for the human part of him and tried to find the boundary where he ended. He hit the bone composite structure's outer wall and came down on one knee. Left side, cracked. The filtration unit, cracked. 40%, becoming everything. He stood up. The Argent was flooding in through the gap in the filtration unit, and his devil trigger was rising with it, and this time, he didn't push it back. This time, he made a different decision. Not letting the Argent in, not surrendering the channel, but taking the devil trigger on his own terms, with his own purpose, in burning it clean through intention rather than exclusion. His father had fought demons with demonic power his entire life and never lost himself in it. His mother had loved a demon and never lost herself. He was both of theirs. The devil trigger activated at a level that was entirely his, and the Argent pushing at its edges burned off as output rather than input, and Dante moved toward Ranak with the clarity of someone who had just, in the middle of a fight, resolved something they'd been carrying for 2 days. Gojo was already at the first junction point. The junction points broke in sequence. Gojo took the first with hollow purple at minimum output. Surgical. Contained. The void filling with clean, rune arc energy. Rather than ambient Argent, the junction node's geometry collapsing without the catastrophic discharge that a larger technique would have produced. The conduit network dimmed. The Argent column above the ritual site flickered for the first time since the summoning began, 11 days ago. Dante was inside Ranak's reach by the time the second junction broke. The Hell Priest had redirected his attention from the half-demon. A tactical error Ranak would reflect later if reflection had been available to him. Toward the white-haired one systematically dismantling his life's work from the outside in. Dante put rebellion through Ranak's left shoulder with the specific angle, Doctor, Chen's briefing had identified, and the Hell Priest's Argent output spiked and then fractured, the organized geometry of his power losing coherence the way an argument lost coherence when its central premise was removed by a sword. Ranak reached for the emergency invocation protocol. His right hand was still functional. The doorway didn't require both hands. Dante took his right hand. Not gently. Gojo destroyed the third junction point from 40 meters away, the hollow purple arc precise enough to take the node without touching the structure around it. The Argent column went out. Not dimmed, extinguished, instantaneous, as if the ritual site had exhaled for the first time in 11 days and found nothing left to breathe. The bone composite structure groaned through its entire height. The conduit channels went dark in sequence, so each one carrying its last pulse of Argent energy outward into the Vienna air and then going quiet. The demon concentration that had been directed by Ranak's organizational principle lost its direction. Not immediately. The transition taking 30 seconds, 40, the coordination dissolving the way smoke dissolved. Gradually and then all at once. The Doom Slayer, who had been working through the undirected concentration with the absolute commitment of something that had a philosophy about incomplete work, did not stop. He would not stop until the last one in the city was down. Dante knew this without being told, had understood it somehow since the first time he'd watched the Slayer move. This was not a man who stopped. This was someone who had decided at a point so far back in his history that the decision had become biology. That stopping was not available to him. Dante could relate to that more than he'd expected to when he'd arrived. Deag Ranak's physical form was present but non-functional. The Hell Priest's actual consciousness already retreating through whatever transit system the priests used, abandoning the meat of the moment for the survival of the purpose. Alive, escaped. The ritual failed, but the priest intact. Dante stood in the center of what had been the Ringstrasse, in the sudden, relative quiet of an undirected rather than directed battle, and took inventory. Left side, 2 cracked ribs, possibly 3. Filtration unit, destroyed. Argent exposure in his system at a level Dr. Chen would have a detailed and uncomfortable conversation about in the morning. Devil Trigger, resolved. Genuinely resolved. Not managed, not suppressed, but settled into something that felt like it understood its own terms for the first time since arrival in this dimension. He looked at the dead Argent column, at the dispersing luminescence, at Gojo, who was standing at the far side of the ritual site with his hands in his pockets and his blindfold still perfectly in place, looking at the sky above Vienna where the orange-brown ceiling was thinning slightly, the ritual's contribution to the atmospheric corruption ending with the ritual. Gojo turned toward him. "You resolved the Devil Trigger issue," he said. "Yeah." Dante looked at his own hands, at the faint, residual output that was entirely his own, clean of everything that wasn't. "Figured out what my father knew that I didn't." "Which was?" "That you don't fight the demon half," Dante said. You make sure the demon half knows what it's fighting for. Then it fights for that instead of for itself." Gojo was quiet for a moment. Genuinely quiet. The 6 eyes processing something that wasn't tactical. "That's not entirely different from what I do," he said. "I know," Dante said. "Took me 2 days and 1 hell priest to figure out you're not as different from me as you act." Gojo almost smiled. Behind the blindfold, there was the quality of something that would have been a smile if the person wearing it had decided smiling was something he did. 3 days later, a UAC transport arrived in Vienna carrying the convoy from the Rhine corridor, the survivors from the metro station, and 43 people from a Montana community center that Vega's network had been routing toward safety since Hayden had given the coordinates. Esprecht organized the arrivals with the exhausted efficiency of someone who had been doing impossible logistics for 3 years and had gotten very good at it. Gojo helped without being asked, which surprised everyone and surprised himself. Dante sat on a concrete barrier at the edge of what had been the ritual site, watching the Argent column's absence in the sky, and thought about his father. About the specific knowledge Sparda had carried that made him able to fight demons with demonic power for centuries without losing himself in it. About how that knowledge wasn't external, wasn't a technique or a tool, but was something Sparda had understood about his own nature that Dante had been circling since he was old enough to hold a sword. The Argent exposure Dr. Chen assessed the next morning was, in her words, significant. Now, the neurological drift from the corridor campaign, the marauder fights, the ritual site saturation. It would take weeks to fully metabolize, and she was cautiously uncertain about 2 specific markers that she wanted to monitor. She did not say the drift was structural. She said she wasn't sure yet. Dante filed this the way he filed everything that required attention later, which was with the specific awareness that later always arrived. The Doomslayer moved east before dawn on the 4th day, toward whatever the next direction was, toward the ongoing war, toward the next demon concentration and the next portal, and the next assessment of everything demonic dying as a necessary and non-negotiable outcome. He didn't say goodbye. Dante hadn't expected him to. He did pause, briefly, at the eastern edge of the city, but in a way that wasn't quite acknowledgement and wasn't quite nothing. Dante raised 2 fingers. The Slayer continued east. "What now?" Gojo asked. Dante looked at the sky, the orange-brown ceiling that never fully broke, the Argent atmospheric contamination that would outlast the ritual by months. Hayden's network pushing recovery resources toward every surviving population center. The war continuing in every direction, 3 years in, no ending visible in any near-term projection. He thought about going home. He thought about the portal that had grabbed them, the dimensional overlap, the Argent frequency that had resonated with his demonic half. He thought about whether that door was still there, and whether he could find it, and whether finding it was the first thing he would do, somewhere to the east, and a hell portal pulsed with the quiet regularity of a wound that hadn't closed. Somewhere in the Hell Dimension's organizational structure, Deg Ranak was intact and calculating the next approach. The icon of sin remained real. Delayed, not prevented. "I don't know yet," Dante said, which was honest. "But Ranak got away." "Yes," Gojo said. "So there's unfinished work." Gojo tilted his head. The motion that meant he had arrived at a position and was deciding whether to state it. "There's always unfinished work in a place like this," he said. "The question is whether it's our unfinished work or just unfinished work." Dante thought about the Devil Trigger resolution, about 2 days of Argent exposure and what it had cost and what it had clarified. About 43 survivors in Montana who were alive because they'd cleared a corridor. "Ask me tomorrow," he said. He didn't leave tomorrow. He didn't leave the day after. The work kept presenting itself, and he kept finding reasons why the next piece of it needed doing before he checked the dimensional portal frequency. Whether this was heroism or stubbornness or the Argent neurological drift that Dr. Chen was still monitoring, he genuinely wasn't sure. Possibly it was all 3. Hell had given Dante many things over his lifetime: enemies, purpose, the specific understanding of demonic power that came from carrying it in your blood since birth. It had never managed to give him the thing he'd spent most of his life assuming it eventually would, which was a reason to stop. Neither would this one. Hell sent 2 demons to fight it, and found instead that one of them had always been its best argument against itself, and the other had never once considered the possibility of losing. More stories await.